All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsor for the month of Teves, Mrs. Selma Woolf, with immense gratitude for the refuos from our Kadosh Baruch Hu and the merit of a refuah sheleima for all of those in need, in the zchus of our brave soldiers, and in the zchus of the return of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsor, Chazzan Mark Childs of Santa Barbara, California, in appreciation of the Daf Yomi shir and in the zchus of refuah sheleima for Binyomin Yankel ben Bayla. Beautiful. And of course, as a shir, we dedicate the entire Maseches Baba Kamo Le'ilui Nishmas, Master Sergeant Eliyahu Harush, Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, his Neshama will have an aliya and the family in Neshama. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. A really great daf. Some really very interesting cases that in Meretz Hashem we are going to cover. Okay, so today's daf is Memchas 48, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Mem Zayin Lebeis 47b in the wide lines at the two dots, Mesve. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 lines up from the bottom. So what says, if you remember again, just to give a little bit of context, the Mishnah said as follows. The Mishnah said that Halocha L'maisa, Ruvain brings his produce into Shimon's field, right? And without without permission, and Shimon's animal, let's say, is injured or dies as a result of the fruit, that ultimately, again, Ruvain is chayiv. Now, remember, Rav came along in yesterday's Gemara and qualified this ruling. And Rav said, when is that true? That's true if Shimon's animal slipped on Ruvain's fruit. But if Shimon's animal overindulged and ate too much fruit and then died, then what? Ruvain is pater and Shimon is chayiv. Or Shimon is chayiv. In other words, Shimon is responsible. Why is Shimon responsible? Because the owner of an animal is obligated to oversee the consumption of his animal. That's part of animal responsibility 101, right? That at the end of the day, you are responsible to see how much your animal eats. Okay, so that's the mindset that we're going for now. So Gemara says, Meseg, Gemara is a kasha. Interesting case. A woman, or call her Rachel, right? Rachel, Ruvain has a mill, right? The mill in which he grinds wheat. So Rachel goes into Ruvain's mill without Ruvain's permission to grind wheat. And ultimately, again, what happens while she's there? Ruvain's animal eats Rachel's wheat. What's talacha? Pater. So obviously, again, Ruvain's going to be pater because Rachel entered in without permission. Im huska, what happens if ultimately, again, the animal is damaged? What happens if the animal is damaged? Then ultimately, chayaves. Then Rachel is going to be liable. I asked the Gemara, va'amai, nema havile shelotochal. Then I will say, we're assuming over here that when it says damaged, how is the animal being damaged? The animal ate too much. But I don't understand, based on what we said before, the halacha is, when an animal eats too much, whose responsibility is that? It's the owner's. So why can't we say ultimately to Ruvain, watch your animal? So the Gemara says, V'amai nema havile shelotochal. The Gemara says, So I don't understand. The Gemara says, 1 second. We should be setting up this case the same way we set up the Mishnah. How do we set up the Mishnah's case? How is Ruvain's produce doing damage to Shimon's animal? How is that happening? The animal is slippage. So why wouldn't we assume that it's the same exact issue over here? When Rachel comes in to go ahead and grind wheat in Ruvain's mill without Ruvain's permission, when we speak about Ruvain's animal being damaged, how is Ruvain's animal being damaged? It slips on the wheat. It's not a case of consumption. It's a case of slipping. So the Gemara says, the karila, my karila, that makes a lot of sense. So then why is the questioner, right? Why is the person bringing up this question? Why is he assuming that halacha l'maisa, this is a case of consumption and not a case of slipping? So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. So we'll say it's interesting. The lashon of the Mishnah, the wording of the Mishnah is huska bahen. If, again, in the case of the Mishnah, Shimon's animal becomes damaged in the produce of Ruvain. That lashon of bahen in it indicates that the damage is not done through consumption, but rather how is the damage done? Through slipping. Aval hacha katonim huska velo katoni bahen. But here in the case of Rachel walking into the grinding mill of Ruvain, it doesn't say Huska Bahen, it just says Huska, right? And Ruvain's animal was damaged through Rachel's produce. So that sounds like Achilohu Diktani, that sounds like it's consumption. That's why we initially thought that we're talking about a case of consumption. Kamash Malan, it's not consumption, but rather, again, it could also be, like the Mishnah, a case of slippage. So the Gemara says, the other opinion will say, no, don't get caught up in the nuances of wording, which is so interesting about saying, sometimes we are all about the nuances of wording, and sometimes we're like, don't get caught up in the nuances of wording. I was saying, no, it's true, you see this all the time in relationships. Right? Sometimes in relationships, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it, and it's the particular word choices you make. Right? And sometimes that conveys the full meaning. And if you miss that, you miss the impact of what, a significant other is trying to tell you. Other times you could get into trouble reading into things too much. Right? And people just mean what it is that they're saying, and they're not trying to convey anything additional. How do you know which one is which? No idea, right? In other words, that's part of the dynamic of relationships. When in fact to look for nuance in what is being said, and ultimately again when just to be able to take things at face value. Incredibly profound. Okay, in any event, the Gemara says false. Tashma. Hichnis shor lechatzer balabai shelo b'shos. Another case. Ruvain brings his shar into the chatzar of Shimon without permission. Bachol chitin. Now what happens? Now Shimon's ox goes ahead and so Vachol chitin, the ox goes in and eats wheat, the histris umes. And ultimately, again, the animal actually, histris means the animal developed diarrhea, severe diarrhea, and died. So what's the halacha? Pater. Ultimately, again, Abba says, so this is the case of where Ruvain is bringing his shar into Shimon's domain, Shimon's chatzar, without Shimon's permission. The shar eats Shimon's produce. Shar becomes sick and dies. So now the Gemara says that ultimately Shimon's going to be pater. Shimon's pater. But if Ruvain had permission to bring his shar into Shimon's rishos, and then the shar eats Shimon's produce, and the shar dies, then Shimon is going to be chayiv. V'amai, but I don't understand. We just said before, based on Rav, that when it comes to consumption, who's obligated to monitor consumption? The owner of the animal. The owner of the animal. Amarava, Bershus Ashalo Reshus Kabramis, Bershus Shmiras Shoro Kibel Alov, Vafilu Chanekes Asmos. The Gemara says it's not a fair question, because we're operating with the opinion of the Rabbanon in the Mishnah. And what's the opinion of the Rabbanon? That when you allow someone to come into your property, so permission to enter is not just simply permission to enter. What is it? It's assumption of complete responsibility. So when Shimon allows Ruvain to bring his shar into Shimon's field, what Shimon is guaranteeing is not just the right to enter Shimon's field, he's guaranteeing the safety of Ruvain's shar. And should something happen to Ruvain's shar, who bears the responsibility of that? Shimon. So we'll say, and again, we know that point itself is a point of contention, it's a point of machlokas in the Mishnah, right? Rebbe, we're going to see in just a little bit, Rebbe doesn't subscribe to that idea. But just, that's the Gemara is going with for now. Good, let's go back to it. So we'll say, it's now the Gemara kind of seizes on that point. So now you're telling me is that when Shimon gives Ruvain permission to enter doesn't just mean permission for entry, but it also means assumption of liability. So Gemara says, okay, let's go with that. When we say that when Shimon grants permission to enter, permission for entry means assumption of liability and responsibility, what's the extent of that responsibility? So the Gemara says, Mao, the nafshehu de kabbalalei, or dilma fila nitirusa da alma. So we'll say when Shimon goes ahead and says to Reuven, you could come in, right? You could come in, right? And halacha l'maisa. Now we're saying that means assumption of responsibility. So what does that mean? Is Shimon saying to Reuven, I am taking responsibility that I will not cause you damage, right? That while you or your ox are in my property, you will not be damaged by me. But I can't guarantee what happens through other circumstances. In other words, we'll say, a tree branch falls down and kills Reuven's ox. So is Shimon taking responsibility for that or not? In other words, if we go with the approach that permission for entry represents assumption of responsibility, what is the extent of that responsibility? Is Shimon just guaranteeing Reuven, I won't do you any harm? In other words, I am safeguarding you from any harm from me, but I'm not safeguarding you, I'm not guaranteeing you safety from other things that could occur independent of me, or maybe not. Odilma, maybe not. Maybe permission for entry means assumption of all liability and responsibility to safeguard Reuven and his property from any and all harm. So Tashma, Tana Rabbi Yehuda bar Simon, Ben Izakin, the Gemara says, so let's analyze this. Tashma, the Tana Rabbi Yehuda bar Simon, Ben Izakin de Beikarno. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda bar Simon went ahead and when they were teaching the sugya of Nezikin in Beikarno, Hichnis Peros of L'chatzar Balabai Shelo B'Shus. Reuven brought his produce into Shimon's domain without permission. Ubashar mimakom acher va'achlan. Now, I'll say this is an interesting twist on the case. Watch this. Reuven brought his produce into Shimon's chatzar, into Shimon's field. Okay, Levi's ox, Levi, out of nowhere, Levi's ox comes in to Shimon's field and what? Achlan, and eats the produce, and eats Reuven's produce. So what's the halacha? Pater. Ultimately, he's pater. He's pater. Now we're going to see who the he is in just a moment. But if Reuven brought his produce into Shimon's field with permission, and then Levi's ox comes along and consumes it, ultimately chayiv, he's chayiv. So the Gemara says, man pater, man chayiv. Who's pater and who's chayiv? Lav, so the Gemara says, bal chotzer. The chayiv bal chotzer amri. So we'll say, so b'pashtos we're assuming this is the bal chotzer. It's Shimon. So therefore, what is the Brisa saying? This is actually exactly our question. What the Brisa is saying is, if Reuven brought his produce into Shimon's field, and ultimately again Levi's oxen came and ate it, so if Reuven was there with permission, then Shimon is chayiv. If Reuven is not there with permission, then Shimon's not chayiv. So we'll say, what does this show you? What does this show you? This shows you that when you are given permission for entry means that the owner of the chatzar is assuming complete responsibility for your safety, both from himself as well as from other circumstances. Incredible. And therefore, again, when Shimon allows Reuven to enter, even though now it's Levi's ox that is coming and consuming Reuven's produce, Shimon assumes responsibility. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not what it means. The Gemara says, no. Pater balashar v'chaya balashar. No. Responsibility we're not talking about over here is on Shimon. Who's the potentially responsible party? Levi, the owner of the shar. The owner of the shar who came into Shimon's chatzar and ate Reuven's produce. So the Gemara says, one second. V'i balashar. If we're talking about Levi, the owner of the shar, top of Memches, my birshus or my shelo birshus ika. What does it mean with rishus? In other words, we'll say we assume that with rishus was referring to Reuven's ability to bring his produce into Shimon's property. We'll say Memches Amdala 48a, first line. So the Gemara says, Amri, that's now second line. Amri, Birshos, Havi l'shein Birshos hanizak, v'shein Birshos hanizak chayeves. Shalo Birshos, Havi l'shein Birshos harabim, v'shein Birshos harabim petura. So we'll say this is interesting. So the Gemara says is like this. We're actually talking about the following case. Right? Let's just frame the whole thing over here. Reuven has produce. Reuven brings his produce into Shimon's field, and now Levi's ox comes and consumes Reuven's produce in Shimon's field. So what's the liability? The Gemara says it depends. If ultimately, again, there was reshus. Now the way the Gemara is looking at reshus is, if Levi's ox has a right to be there, the Rabbi say this is called shein birshus hanizak. Again, we've spoken on this before. Shein, what shein? Damage done through the process of self-gratification, right? Of some type of hana. So this is shein birshus hanizak. So if Levi has the right to be there, this is shein in the property of the damaged party. And the halach is that what? Shein birshus hanizak is chayiv nezak shalim, complete damages. If Levi doesn't have the right to be there, then what? Then this is considered to be shein birshus harabim. Now, obviously, it's not literally birshus harabim. Why? Because Lamaisa, again, remember, this is happening in Shimon's property, but it's considered to be, it's treated like shein birshus harabim. And what's the halacha of shein birshus harabim? Ultimately, again, you're pater. So therefore, I will say the Gemara just totally reimagines this case, that the chayiv and pater is not talking on Shimon, the owner of the property, but rather the chayiv and pater is talking about Levi, the owner of the shar. Incredible. So Tashma, hichnis shor l'chatzar balabai shelo birshus. Watch this. Reuven brings his ox into Shimon's property without Shimon's permission. And a shar comes from another place. And Earl says, now there's a third shar. Levi's shar comes from somewhere else. And what? Nagcho gores Ruvain's shar. What's the halacha? Pater. He's pater. But if he brought in, if Ruvain had permission to bring in his ox, then ultimately again he'll be chayiv. So the Gemara says, okay, man pater uman chayiv. Who's pater? Who's chayiv? Lav pater bal chatzar v'chayiv bal chatzar. Both say Pasha is talking about Shimon, the owner of the chatzar. Both say, remember again, what's our overarching question we're trying to figure out over here? If you go with the idea, like the Rabbanan and the Mishnah, which is that permission to enter assumes assumption of, or I should say, permission to enter also means assumption of responsibility over the person or property that is entering. What is the extent of that responsibility? Is that just Shimon telling Ruvain, I will not harm you? I will not harm you, but I'm not taking responsibility from any external forces that are not me from harming you? Or does it mean I take full responsibility over all forces that may harm you while you are in my property? That's what we're trying to figure out over here. So the Gemara looks at this case, right? Ruvain brings his ox into his shar into Shimon's property. Now what happens? Levi's ox comes in, gores Ruvain's ox and kills it. Okay, so now the Gemara says, if Ruvain brought it in without refuos, so ultimately again, he is pater. If ultimately he brings it in with refuos, he is chayiv. Who is the he? Who is the he? So the Gemara says, we assume the he is Shimon. Shimon. And what do you see from here? You see from here that when you give someone permission to enter means assumption of full responsibility. And therefore, if Shimon gave Reuven the right to enter, and Levi's ox gores Reuven's ox, right, then what? Then Shimon is responsible for those damages. To which the Gemara says, lo, pater balashar v'chayev balashar. Once again, the Gemara says, no. Chayev and pater over here is not talking about Levi, but rather it's not talking about Shimon, the owner of the chatzar. Rather, it's talking about Levi, the owner of the shar. Ihachi, my bershos, so my shelo bershos. If that's the case, then what does it mean when it says bershos and not bershos? Right? The Gemara says, Amri hamani Rabbi Tarfani the Amar mishune karen bechatzar hanizak nezek shali mishalim. So listen to this, Rabbi, because this reflected Rabbi Tarfon. A lot of stuff coming out of it here today. We also remember again we had Rabbi Tarfon a number of times. Rabbi Tarfon holds that karen bershus hanizak is chayiv nezek shalim. Remember, even karen tam. Even first time Karen, Rabbi Tarfon says, if it is performed in the property, ultimately again of the damaged party of the nizak, you're going to be chayiv nezek shalim. So watch this. The Gemara says, so therefore, b'shos havile Karen bechatzar nizak b'shalim nezek shalim. Therefore, if Levi's animal enters in with permission, then this is considered to be a case of Karen tam b'shos hanizak, and therefore you have to pay full damages. Shelo b'shos, but ultimately, again, if the animal is entering in without permission, havile Karen b'shos harabim, then it's not literally Karen b'shos harabim, but it's like Karen b'shos harabim, v'lo meshalna ela chatzi nezek, and therefore you only have to pay chatzi nezek. Okay, so say, so it's unresolved. It's unresolved. In other words, we're not exactly sure. So what is it? In other words, if we go with the assumption that permission to enter means assumption of responsibility, what is the extent of that responsibility? Does that mean complete responsibility from any damaging forces, either Shimon himself or anything else that may damage Ruvain, or no? It's only Shimon guaranteeing Ruvain's safety from himself. I won't damage you, but I'm not guaranteeing what may or may not happen ultimately, again, through someone else. Incredible. So let's go back there. Says the Gemara, Hichnis shoro l'chatzar balabayis. Next. I skipped, just the whole chunk there. Hahi isisa. Because we'll say another interesting case. Hahi isisa, the also lemefa bahu beisa. There was a woman who went in to bake her bread in a particular home. Okay. Asa barcha demar de beisa achla lalisha chavalamis. The goat of the owner of the home, we'll call him Ruvain. So we'll call the woman Rachel. Rachel goes into Ruvain's house to bake her bread, to bake her dough. Ruvain's goat comes along and partakes of the dough and dies as a result of consuming the dough. All right. So what's the halacha? Chayiva Rava l'shleima d'mei barcha. Rava said that Rachel is chayiv to pay for the dead goat. Right? She did the damage, and therefore she's chayiv to go ahead and pay for the goat. I says the Gemara, okay, so one second, let's analyze this. Lema pliga ad Rav. Now remember again, obviously, it must be that Rava is arguing on Rav. What did Rav say? Rav said, who is responsible for consumption of the animal? Who's responsible? The owner. So therefore, again, anytime the animal eats something and dies as a result of that, that's going to really be on the owner himself. So Rav ultimately, remember, Rav says that the owner is always responsible for consumption. To which the Gemara says, Amri hachi hashta hasam shelo bershus, lo kibal alei nitirusa. Hacha bershus, kibal alei nitirusa. So Rabbi say, this is fascinating. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says that that's true when ultimately, again, the person entering didn't have reshus to be there. But if the person entering has reshus to be there, then what? Rabbi say, listen to this. Then ultimately, again, there is a certain level of responsibility, ultimately, again, that the person who is there has to safeguard the animals of the owner of the chatzar. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Hacha birshus kibalene tirusa. Rashi says the behemto v'taima de Rava lab mishum de kasaver de man da al birshus kabel alene tirusa de behemos bal chatzar da iu de shani leal kul rabbanani v'uki de bal kederos ki al birshus lo kibel alav nitirusa v'hacha ki de mefarish taima lekamei de lemeifa bayetz niusa v'staliko mervasa de chatzar. Gemara is supposed to listen to this. This is fascinating. So the Gemara says, the Gemara is introducing a new idea over here. That why is Rachel chayaves? Why is Rachel liable for the death of the goat? Because when you are given permission to enter, so that comes with responsibility as well. What's the responsibility on Rachel? The responsibility on Rachel is don't do harm to Shimon. In other words, we've been focusing this entire time that when you give someone permission to enter, that comes with an implied responsibility or liability for their safeguarding as well. Now what we're also introducing is that when you enter with permission, you also have certain responsibility, right? You also have responsibility to make sure that what? That you don't damage the owner of the chatzar in any way. So therefore, Rachel, you're coming in with reshus, you have a right to bake bread, okay, but you also have an obligation to safeguard the livestock of Shimon. So therefore, watch your dough, guard your dough, and if you fail to do so, and as a result, the goat of Shimon dies, you are responsible for that. So one says, okay, but one second, we just had the case before. We just had the case literally on Amud Beis. Rachel went into Shimon's home without reshus to go out and grind wheat, right? And what happened? And the animal and Shimon's animal went ahead and ate some of that wheat and died. And what did we say? That Rachel's potter. Right, so va'achaltan behemto shal balabais pater v'imhuska chayaves, and ultimately again, if the animal is damaged, if the animal ate of it, it's so ultimately again she's pater. But if I should say Shimon's pater, but ultimately again, if the animal was damaged, ultimately she's going to be chayaves. So what's the logic? Time shelo b'shus. Now the reason why she's chayaves is because ultimately again she entered in without permission. Habirshus. But bepashtos, if she went in with permission, pater, then she ultimately again should be exempt. So in the case of the grinding of the wheat, if she entered in with reshus and the animal ate of the wheat and died, she was pater. Yet in this case, Rachel's entering in with reshus to go ahead and knead her dough, right, to go ahead and bake her bread. And if the animal eats of her bread and dies, she's chayaves, she's liable. So why the distinction between the two cases? So I would say this is actually interesting. So the Gemara says, Amri, Litchon chitin, kevan de lobaya tzni usa midi, lobaya misalki mirabasa de chatzar nafshayu, va'alei didei raminitirusa. I will say this is fascinating. The Gemara says it all lies in a fundamental distinction between grinding and baking. Grinding, I will say, the process of grinding wheat, if a woman's doing it, doesn't require any level of privacy. Doesn't require any level of tznius. And therefore, again, the responsibility to guard the owner is really on. Remember, we're going back to Rav. We keep going back to Rav. That what does Rav say? When it comes to consumption, responsibility for consumption of the animal rests on who? The owner. The owner. And therefore, when it comes to grinding wheat, where no privacy is required, so therefore the responsibility is on the owner to monitor the consumption of his animal. And therefore, if he fails to do so, and the animal dies as a result of consuming some of the wheat that Rachel is grinding, ultimately, again, that is on the owner. That's on the owner. Aval meifa kevan de bayetz niusa. So we'll say, listen to this. When it comes to baking requires privacy for Rachel. Why? Rashi points out because when a woman bakes, she has to knead the dough. When she has to knead dough, she has to roll up her sleeves. So it's not appropriate for another man to be present while her sleeves are rolled up. So therefore, by definition, that requires a degree of privacy. Because that requires a degree of privacy, therefore, kevan de bayitz niusa meravasa de chatzar, since she requires privacy from the owner of the chatzar, misalki nafshayhu. Ultimately, again, he removes himself. In other words, he's not going to be there. And therefore, because he removes himself, hilchach ala dida ramya netirusa. Therefore, I will say, because he can't be there, therefore, again, the responsibility for safeguarding the animal shifts to Rachel. So quite fascinating. So in other words, I will say, so in general, so it sounds like what's coming out of here is as follows. What seems to be coming out of here is like this. That first of all, seems to be the Gemara is going with the idea, although we'll see halacha l'maisa what we do, that in general, when you allow someone to enter into your property, there is an assumption of responsibility for the safety of that person and of their property. Okay? What we've also established is that halacha l'maisa. So now what we don't know is what's the extent of that liability, right? Is that liability just for anything that the owner of the chatzar will do or from any other circumstances? What also comes out is something interesting, which is the way passing like Rav, that the owner of an animal is always responsible to monitor and to oversee that which his animal is consuming. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if produce is brought into the property, and ultimately, whether it's refuos or not refuos, and the animal overindulges and dies, ultimately, again, that's on the owner. That's on the owner. If, again, the animal slips and dies or is injured, then that'll depend whether or not, again, Reuben brought it in with refuos, with not refuos. The one exception to the consumption rule of Rav will be in a case where the owner can't be present. What's the case of where the owner can't be present? Rachel is kneading dough. She's kneading dough. So in that case, again, that requires some degree of modesty and of privacy. The owner can't be there. If the owner can't be there, then the responsibility to take care of the animals or to make sure the animals don't overindulge or don't eat, that's going to shift to Rachel. Fascinating. All right, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Hichnis shoro l'chatzar balabais. So here we go. Amar Rava. Hichnis shoro. So we're saying we're going to go now through like a whole bunch of statements of Rava. Really interesting statements. So here we go. Amar Rava. Hichnis shoro l'chatzar balabais shelo b'shos. We'll say what happens if Reuven brought his shar into Shimon's chatzar without permission, without rishos. The chafer boros sichin u'ma'aros is interesting. So now what happens? Reuven's animal digs pits, boros, digs a bar in Shimon's property. What's the halacha? Bal hashar chayi b'niskei chatzar u'bal chatzar chayi b'niskei habar. This is interesting. So Reuven, the owner of the shar, is responsible ultimately again for the damage done to Shimon's field. But Shimon is responsible. Let's say again, Abba says someone falls into that bar or something else happens in that bar. That's on Shimon. That's on Shimon. Now I will say, even though in general there's only liability for man-made bar, not for a shar-made bar. This case is different, I will say. Why? Because in this case, since the bar is being created in Shimon's property, Shimon has the responsibility to do what? Shimon's responsibility to fill it in. I was about to say, if something happens in your property, so just want to point out, so what's happening over here? Reuven's shar is entering into Shimon's property. Reuven's shar digs a bar. Reuven's shar digs a bar. So now I will say, so Reuven is liable for the destruction done to Shimon's field. If Shimon fails to fill in the bar, and as a result, again, there is damage done. Now, there's more details over here about Shimon making his property hefker and things like that, which Rashi points out over here. But the point over here is, in this case, if Shimon fails to remedy the situation, then ultimately, again, liability is on Shimon. Right? That's the halacha. Now, both say, now remember again, bar really only works if it's hefker, so it also have to be that Shimon's making his property hefker, that's how someone else is accessing the bar. But again, we don't have to get into those details right now. Let's say profound Mr. Haskell on this. Sometimes in life, other people create problems for us. It happens, right? I don't know, a lot of times. Sometimes, right? I didn't create the problem. Someone else created it for me. But just because I didn't create it doesn't mean I'm not obligated to fix it. Right? Even though I didn't make it, I'm obligated to fix it. And failure to fix a problem that is yours, even though you didn't create it, that's on you. That's on you. Now responsible for creating, but we'll say, my situational, the situations have been created, problems are created. I didn't do it. Okay, I got it. You didn't do it. But even though you didn't do it, if it's yours, right? If it's yours, if it's now, it becomes your problem, you are obligated to go ahead and remedy it. Such a profound yisur. I will say, how many times in life does it happen? Other people create circumstances for us, and then we figure, okay, someone else created it, you have to fix it. And what happens? People spend their lives waiting for other people to fix their problems. Even if someone else made the mess. If it's now my mess, it's on me to clean it up. Incredible. Let's go back there. Another case we'll say. Right, Rava says, what happens? So Reuven brought in his shar to Shimon's chatzar without rishos. Vehizik as balabayis. So we'll say, this is interesting. Oh, balabayis huzak bo. So we'll say, listen to this. In this case, so Reuven brought his shar into Shimon's chatzar without rishos. Reuven's shar injures Shimon. It injures Shimon. Or Shimon trips over Reuven's shar, right? Chayiv, ultimately, again, Reuven's going to be chayiv. Ravatz, however, again, if Shimon's shar squatted, ultimately, again, pater. If Reuven's shar squatted, ultimately, again, is going to be pater. So, okay, so we'll say, Bepashtos, what Rashi says, what that sounds like is, so here's what we know, right? Reuven brought his shar into Shimon's chatzar without permission. The shar, Reuven's shar, then either injured Shimon or Shimon tripped over the shar. Reuven is liable. Then it says, but if Reuven's shar squatted, now Rashi points out, we're assuming that what squatting means is like it squatted on top of utensils and broke the utensils, Reuven is going to be pater. So Gemara says, Mishum de Ravat's pater. I understand why. Just because it's squatted, Reuven should be pater. Why should it be pater in that case? Rapapa my Ravas sheher bis gelalim v'nitfu kelav shabalabayis tahavi gelalim bar. Now, we'll say, what's the case? Rav Papa says, what's the case of squatting? The case is, it's squatted on top of utensils, defecated on those utensils, and ruined the utensils. Now, we'll say, what is this a case of? Ultimately, again, the havi gilalim bar. The defecation is the waste is considered to be like a bar. And we'll say, again, on a technicality, there's no bar liability for damage of utensils, right? Bar, you're only liable if you damage people or damage animals. But damaging of utensils is no liability. So the Gemara says, okay, that works fine according to Shmuel, because according to Shmuel, any obstacle is called a bar. According to Rav, something is only called a bar if it's hefker. So what are you going to do in this case? So Gemara says, that's easy. Most times, people are mafkir waste. Most times. Not all the time, because you can use it as fertilizer as well. But most times, people are mafkir. Okay, Vama Rava, we'll say another case of Rava. First of the wide lines on the bottom. Vama Rava. Nichnas l'chatzar balabayis shelo b'rishos. If ultimately, again, if Reuven entered into Shimon's chatzar without rishos, v'hizik es balabayis or balabayis hizik bo. And I will say, in this case, Reuven himself is damaging Shimon, or Shimon trips over Reuven. What's the halacha? Chayiv. Ultimately, again, so Reuven is going to be chayiv for damages done to Shimon. His ziko balabayis is interesting. What happens if Shimon damages Reuven? Pater. Ultimately, again, Shimon is going to be pater. Now, I will say, now, why is Shimon pater? So, Papa lo amran ela de lo hava yadabe. I will say that's only true if Shimon did not know that Reuven was in his chatzar. Aval hava yadabe. But if Shimon knew that Reuven was there, his ziko balabai is chayiv, and Shimon damages Reuven, Shimon will be chayiv. Why? My taima mishum damarle, because again, Reuven could say to Shimon, Nehid islach rishus lafuke. You have permission to throw me out of your chaser, la'azuki les lach rishus. But ultimately, to damage me, you don't have rishus. Both say this is really a fascinating case. See what's happening over here? Here, we're totally transitioning away from animals doing damage and people doing damage. Reuven enters into Shimon's rishus without permission. Right? So what's the halacha? If Reuven damages Shimon, or Shimon trips over Reuven and is damaged like that, Reuven is liable. What happens if Shimon damages Reuven? So ultimately, what's the halacha? Pater. The Gemara qualifies that. When is he pater? When Shimon didn't know that Reuven was in his chatzar, and therefore, again, the damage that he inflicted was accidental. But if Shimon knew that Reuven was in his chatzar and damaged him anyway, ultimately, again, then Shimon is going to be liable. Why? This is very important. Because Reuven can say to Shimon, look, you have every right to throw me out of your chatzar, but you have no right to what? You have no right to damage me. You have no right to damage me. Interesting halacha. And then go according to their reasoning. The Amar Rabba, Vitim Rapapa, we'll say Amud Beis, Memchas 48b, Shnehem Birshus, or Shnehem Shelo Birshus. So we'll say if you have Reuven and Shimon that are both in the same domain, either with permission or without permission. In other words, we'll say, so let's say, for example, they're both in Rosh Hashanah, they both have the right to be there, or they're both on a jointly owned field, or for that matter, again, they're both somewhere, Shelo Birshus. I both say Shelo Birshus would be, Rashi gives the example of, they're both running in Rosh Hashanah. Most remember again, we saw this, that running in Rosh Hashanah is considered to be mashun, is considered to be abnormal. So I will say, so the point over here is you have a case where Reuven and Shimon are both on the same halachic level. Either they're both permitted to be doing what they're doing, or they're both prohibited from doing what it is that they're doing. And what happens? They end up damaging each other. So what's the halacha? Chayav, and ultimately, again, they're going to be chayiv. Right? They damage each other, they're going to be chayiv. Husku zebazah, if they are damaged by one another, then ultimately, again, pturin. Ultimately, they're pater. Because we'll say, again, essentially it cancels each other. Time of the shneim b'shus, or shneim shelo b'shus. Now, the reason is because both of them have permission to be where they are, or don't have permission to be where they are, do what they're doing. Aval echa b'shus ve'echa shelo b'shus. But I will say, if one person is operating legally and one person is operating illegally, the b'shus pater, the one operating legally is exempt. Shelo b'shus chayiv. The one operating illegally is chayiv. So we'll say that's our case, right? Reuven enters into Shimon's domain without permission, right? Ultimately, again, he ends up injuring Shimon. So again, Reuven's going to be liable. Shimon injures Reuven. Ultimately, Shimon is pater. Now again, obviously we qualify that Shimon's pater because again, if he was taken by surprise or he didn't know what was going on, if he knew what he was doing, it was premeditated injury of Reuven, then obviously he's going to be chayiv in that case. Incredible. Nafal lebar ve'hivishmeim of chayiv. So let's remember again, what was the next case in the Mishnah? The next case in the Mishnah is that Reuven's ox enters into Shimon's domain without reshus. Reuven's ox then falls into, let's say, a water cistern, and then goes ahead and damages the water, makes the water putrid. Ultimately, again, so Reuven will be chayiv. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabba, lo shana el shevish b'shas nefila. This is only assuming that Reuven's ox ruined the water in the cistern when it fell in, b'shas nefila. Aval la'achar nefila pater. But if it was after it fell in, then ultimately, again, it's going to be pater. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Shevish b'shas nefila, tahavi mazik mamish v'lo dami labar. We'll say, when the animal damages the water, right? Let's say ruins the water as it falls in, so that's considered to be an act of damage done by the body of the animal. Now, we'll say, as opposed to the following, you can imagine this has two different scenarios. One scenario is where the ox falls into the water, and just by falling in, it goes in and ruins the water. The other possibility is, what ruins the water? The ox swimming around in there, right? And remaining in there for a prolonged amount of time. That's what ruins the water. So the Gemara says, when is Reuven liable? Reuven is liable when the ox ruins the water simply by the act of falling in. But if the water is only ruined because the ox stays there for a little while, then Reuven will not be chayiv. Reuven will be pater. What's the reason? My taima, haveshar bar umayim kelim v'lomatzinu bar shechayiv bo'asa kelim. So we'll say this is very interesting because we look at the shar, right? So when the shar is ruining the water by remaining there, then lamaisa we look at the shar as a bar, right? And we look at the water as utensils. And what's the halacha? Bar, you're only liable for Adam and Behema, for people and animals, and you're not chayiv for kelim. You're not chayiv for utensils. So that works fine according to Shmuel, who says in general, Shmuel has a more expansive definition of bar. And he says a bar is anything that's essentially an obstacle. El Rav da Amar Adamafkirle, but according to Rav, who says that something is only a bar if you make it hefker. So how do you make the shar, in this case, a bar? Here's what you have to say. When do we say ultimately again that Reuven is liable? When it's the body of the ox that makes the water putrid. But if, let's say, it's the odor of the ox that makes the water putrid, then ultimately pater. The Reuven is going to be pater. What's the reason? My timer, grama ba'almahu, ugrama blo mechayev, because we both say that'll be causation. Causation, right? That'll be grama. And ultimately, again, in other words, if it's the body of the animal itself that's making the water putrid, then that's direct damage. Reuven will be chayiv. But if it's not the body of the animal, but instead it's what? It's the odor of the animal, then that's going to be grama. That's going to be secondary or causation, and one is not chayiv for grama b'ni zakin. Incredible. Okay, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Haya aviv obno l'socho, Mishlam Sakofer. So let's remember, continue on that case. Right, Reuven's ox enters into Shimon's chatzor without permission. The ox falls into the water cistern, and in the water cistern was Reuven's father or son. The ox kills them. What's the halacha? Reuven's chayiv to pay kofar. Okay, says the Gemara, Amai. Hatamhu. But why would Reuven be chayiv to pay kofar? After all, the assumption over here, Abba says that what? The animal is a tam. Animal is a tam. We established only a muad pays kofar. To which the Gemara says, Amarav b'muad lipol al b'nei adam b'boros askinon. All right, so this is interesting, right? The animal is a muad to fall on people and kill them in pits. I would say, in life, it's important to develop a specialty, right? It's always important to carve out a niche, right? So the mice of this bar, and also we've seen this, by the way, it sounds a little bit crazy, but remember, we've seen this concept of like becoming a specialty muad. Remember, again, the end of last week, we saw the ox that gored 3 times with its right horn, right? So it's a muad for going with its right horn, but yet a tam for goring with its left horn. So you can have if an animal does a specific type of damage. So in this case over here, this animal is a muad to fall on people in boros and kill them. Ihaki, if that's the case, bar kitalu. Then again, the animal is liable to death. Rav Yosef, remember again, kofar, you only have to pay once you're a muad, right? But lamaisa, we put an animal to death as soon as what? As soon as it kills someone. So lamaisa, again, even a tam that kills someone, that animal is executed. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Rav Yosef, techaza yiroka v'nafal. No. What's the case? The case over here, I will say, is where the animal doesn't intentionally fall into pits in front of people. Rather, the animal sees vegetation at the lip or at the edge of the pit in its effort to eat the vegetation, and then it falls in like that. Rashi says over Chaz Yiroko, it's almost right across, Esev, Apiabar, Ubalecha v'nafal, Dahach nefila lo echave. So Rabbi says, so this is interesting. So halacha l'maisa, it lacks intentionality over here. It's just trying to go ahead and eat the produce. But again, what ends up happening is it ends up falling into the pit. Shmuel says, Haman, Rabbi Yosef Lili Amar Tam Mishalim Chatzi Kofer. Shmuel on the other hand says, whose opinion is being reflected over here? So Rabbi Yosef Lili says that a tam pays half kofer. Also remember again, this famous position Rabbi Yosef Lili, just like a tam pays Chatzi Nezek. So Rabbi Yosef Lili says a tam pays Chatzi Kofer. Ula Amar Rabbi Yosef Lili Hida Amar Rabbi Tarfon. So Ula says it's Rabbi Yosef Lili who holds the Rabbi Tarfon. What's Rabbi Tarfon say? Damar Karen bechatzra nizak nezek shalim mishalim. So Rabbi Tarfon holds the halach l'maisa just like you pay complete damages nezek shalim for Karen done b'reshus hanizak. So too achanami kofer shalim mishalim. So Rabbi Tarfon holds that you also pay kofer shalim for damage for Karen damage done b'reshus hanizak. Okay. So according to Ula, it makes sense why we're setting it up as father or son inside of the pit. El Shmuel, my area aviv obino, afilu achenami. But according to Shmuel, what does it matter if it's the father or the son or someone else? To which the Gemara says, you're right. Orcha dimil sakatani. Ultimately, again, you're right. It doesn't matter if it was father, son, or someone else. We're just the Mishnah was just framing it as a normative case. What's the normative case? Who's going to be swimming in Reuven's water cistern? The pashtus, a relative of his. Okay. But ultimately, again, if halacha l'maisa, right, Reuven entered in with reshus, then the balachatzer is going to be chayiv. Itmar. So let's listen to this. Rav Amar hilchasa kitanakamo Ushmuel Amar Hilchas HaKarevi. Now, both say, okay, so now we've gone through the Mishnah in its entirety. Now, both remember again, when we come through this entire sugya, we are really left, although there are many sub-machlokim that we're seeing, but we're really left with one major overarching machlokes. What is that overarching machlokes? When Shimon allows Reuven to come into his chaser, Shimon gives reshus. What does reshus mean? Tanakama will say, reshus means, reshus to enter also means assumption of complete liability and responsibility by Shimon. Now there's a machlokes. What does that mean? Is Shimon assuming responsibility over himself? Reuven, I won't harm you. My property won't harm you. But I'm not safeguarding you from any external dangers or damage. Or does it mean no? That Shimon is assuming all responsibility. So that's the machlokes in the Rabbanon. Rebbe holds no. Permission to enter just means what? Enter, but what? Enter at your own risk. Or I am not assuming any level of responsibility, ultimately, again, for anything that happens. I'll just point out to you, this machlokes, although it sounds like, okay, it's interesting, this is a major machlokes. Think about this for just a moment. You invite someone over to your house for Shabbos lunch, right? What happens? Your dog, your kelev ra, that you've been maintaining in your home because you have not been paying attention in shir, right? Is so excited and so happy, so wonderful. They're licking the person, licking the suit, licking everything. It's so cute. Oh, it's so cute, right? And then what happens? Now your cute dog slobbered all over my suit. Most people, normal people, don't like dog slobber, right? And as a result, now I have to go ahead and send it to the cleaners. So I will say, who's responsible for that? So again, the Rabbanon would say, ultimately again, it's clearly Shimon. It's clearly going to be Shimon, right? Because halacha l'maisa, permission to enter comes with assumption of full responsibility. Rebbe says, no. Rebbe says that's not what it means. Permission to enter means you're allowed to come into my house. You're not trespassing. But I'm not assuming any level of responsibility for anything that happens to you, dog slobber or otherwise, right? None of that is my responsibility. So now that in this whole sugya, that is still the overarching, outstanding issue. And how you frame that, everything else kind of falls into place after. So let's go. Says the Gemara Itmar. Rav Amar Hilchas like the Tanakama. So Rav says halachas like the Tanakama, like the Rabbanon in the Mishnah. Permission to enter means full responsibility, assumption of full responsibility. Shmuel Amar Hilchas like Rebbe. Shmuel says no, the halachas like Rebbe. The halachas like Rebbe. Permission to enter just means that. Permission to enter, no assumption of responsibility. So Tan Rabbanon, here we go. Knos Sharcha V'Shamro. So ultimately, and let's listen to this. Reuven says to Shimon, you're allowed to bring in your ox, Knos Sharcha, bring in your ox, V'Shamro. But ultimately, again, you need to watch over your ox. So we'll say here, Shimon is telling Reuven, I'm allowing you to bring your ox into my house, into my chatzar. You need to watch him. Hisko, let's say Reuven's ox does damage, so it's halacha, chayiv. Reuven's chayiv, right? Huzak, if Reuven's ox is damaged, let's say again something happens, right? Shimon's ox gores, Reuven's ox, pater. Shimon's pater, right? Now I will say now again, and this is an interesting case, because in this case again here, Shimon is explicitly saying, I'm giving you permission to come in, but you need to watch over your ox. Knos sharcha v'ani eshmerenu. What happens if Reuven says to Shimon, bring in your ox and I'll watch your ox? Then what's the halacha? Huzak chayiv. If ultimately, again, if the ox gets damaged, then ultimately Shimon is going to be responsible. Hizik pater. But ultimately, again, if the ox does damage, Reuven is going to be pater, right? Because here, I will say, Haguf Akasha. The problem is these two statements are contradictory. How so? Here we go. Amrit Knos Sharcha V'Shamro. So we'll say in the first case over here, where Reuven says to Shimon says to Reuven, bring your ox into my field, I'm giving you permission, but you need to watch it. What's the halacha? Hizik chayiv hozak pater. Ultimately, again, if ultimately, again, the animal did damage, Reuven is going to be liable, but if the animal is damaged, then Shimon, the balachazra, is going to be pater. The reason ultimately, again, why if the ox does damage, Reuven is chayiv is why? Because Shimon the balachazar told him, watch your animal. Upater balachazar, hastama, what we can infer from this is, had Shimon not said anything, Chayiv Bal Chatzar Pata Bal Shar. Sounds like had Shimon not explicitly said to Reuven, right, guard your animal, then the assumption of responsibility would have been on Shimon. The Bistama Mekabal Alei Netirusa. B'Pashtos, it sounds like the stama is that ultimately, again, when you allow for entry, you take responsibility for that animal. Yet a Masefa, look at the end, a Masefa, Knos Sharcha Vani Yeshmeranu. Well, look at the end, right? What's the Sefer case? Bring in your ox, right? And I'll watch it. So this is Shimon saying to Reuven, I'm giving you permission to bring in your ox, and I'll watch your ox. Hozak Chayiv, if ultimately the ox is damaged, Shimon is Chayiv. Hizik Pater, ultimately again, but if it does damage, Reuven is Pater. Kaima Da'amar Levani Yeshmeranu. The reason ultimately this is true is because Shimon explicitly said, I will take responsibility. So the Gemara says, Hudim Chayiv Balachatzer, Pater Balashar. Hastama, Chayiv Balashar, Upatra Balachatzer. So I won't say, but if it was just a stam case where Shimon didn't say anything, Bepashas Reuven would be Chayiv, and Shimon would be Pater. What do you see from here? Stama lo mekabel alei netirusa. What you see from here, I will say, is stam, without explicit articulation. Permission to enter does not mean assumption of responsibility. Ason l'Rebbe da'amar achi kabel alei netirusa. And I this balabais l'shmar. So Reish Shaban. So we'll say, I'm going to stop over here for today. The point is, is making over here is two contradictory inferences, right? One part of the Brisa seems to indicate, like the Rabbanon, namely, permission to enter means assumption of responsibility unless you explicitly articulate to the contrary. So if Reuven gives permission to Shimon to enter, that is Reuven taking full responsibility, unless of course Shimon says, Reuven, you have full responsibility. That's the Rabbanon. Rebbe says, permission to enter just means permission to enter and nothing else. Assumption of full responsibility does not take place unless, of course, the Bala Chatzar, Shimon says so explicitly. Both sides, two contradictory inferences. We'll stop here. Sorry for a cliffhanger. We'll pick up with this tomorrow. See that Allah says, well, Shkoyach.